we start out with essentially 5. We've got a point which simply establishes location. We've got a horizontal line, we've got a diagonal line, and we have a vertical line, and we have an arc, a curve. Now, the interesting thing here really is that only 2 of those marks are found in nature. The dot, the spots all over everything in nature, and curves. There are no straight lines in nature. So right from the beginning, artists understood that what they were doing was abstract. Those 3 lines don't occur. There are no straight lines in nature, none. And yet you're going to see that the artist uses straight lines far more often than he uses curves, because you can formalize, you can measure, you can inflect, you can relate straight lines more easily than you can curves. Curves present all kinds of complications. So we have these marks, and each one, if you give them some thought, represent a mood. If you were to design a piece, sculpture, painting, drawing, with the dominant direction being the horizontal, it would be calm, it would be relaxed, it would be quiet. It's already a mood. The diagonal is phallic. The diagonal is masculine. The diagonal looks like somebody charging with a lance. It's aggressive. It's much more powerful than the vertical or the horizontal. So if you have the charge of the light brigade, you're going to be basing it on the diagonal. The vertical isn't quite as stable as the horizontal. It's much less active than the vertical, but it's balanced, it's ordered, it's upright. Christ in his glory is vertical. Many a portrait is vertical. The curve is an enclosure. It cups, it holds, it relates. You're going to hear the word relate a great deal in this class. So if we do a design based on one of these basic directions, we would say the relationship between each of the elements in our drawing would be that they're of the same family. They're organic. We can introduce 1 or 2 other directions, but we're going to have to be very careful that we don't violate the mood established by the horizontal or the vertical or the diagonal. Now, we can strengthen a line by introducing its perpendicular, a line that intersects at 90 degrees. But we want to be careful that we don't lose our dominant direction with the subordinate. We've got points. So we have a point here and a point there. That gives us a horizontal line. We really don't need the line connecting them, because we've been connecting dots ever since we were infants looking at the night sky. We know little dippers and big dippers and this and that, and parents used to keep us busy connecting the dots on long trips. So the beginning and the end of a line is more important than the line connecting it. And if we take a horizontal, we can turn it into a horizontal rectangle. A diagonal becomes a triangle, or it becomes a cone. The vertical can be a vertical rectangle, and the curve becomes a circle. So we now have, I anticipated myself, this shouldn't be here. We now have 2-dimensional figures. We've got a point, we've got a line, we've got a direction, and now we have 2-dimensional figures, and we can turn those 2-dimensional figures into 3-dimensional figures. And now we have our cone, or we can introduce a pyramid, or we can come in with a circle becoming a sphere. That's it. We've just exhausted our alphabet and our figures. We can combine cubes and squares. We can make polyhedrons, octahedrons. We can make all kinds of shapes. But this is our basic system of building blocks, and it's very, very limited. The only thing I left out with regard to drawing is light and dark, shade, value. We'll get to that later. What we have to do is place the figures we choose to combine to create a drawing in a shape. Traditionally, we design in a rectangle. And that rectangle has a subterranean geometry. it has its own ordered relationships. First of all, we have a pair of vertical lines and a pair of horizontal lines, and where they intersect, we're going to call those eyes. Those are implicit. So those eyes relate to one another horizontally and vertically, and on the diagonal, they divide this in half. And if we divide this horizontally to establish an echo of that, and vertically to echo this, all of these rectangles have the same proportion as the mother. Any rectangle that has the same angle of a diagonal is the same proportion. So if this measures 1 by 1.5, which would be a 1.5 rectangle, these measure 1 by 1.5 as well, and if I continue breaking them down, they will continue to divide accordingly. So any rectangle that shares the same diagonal will have the same proportions, meaning that the shorter will divide into the longer the same number of times. There's a system of design called the golden section, in which we have golden sections, series rectangles, and we have root rectangles. I'm going to show you one. In the 7th lecture, we will discuss it at length, and in the 9th lecture, we will carry on even further. But it consists initially of taking a square, finding the half, and swinging that down with a compass and establishing a rectangle that has the proportions of just about the whole of nature inherent in it. I don't know that I'm going to draw everything slightly distorted because I want to stay out of your way so you can see what I'm doing. These calipers are calibrated on the ratio of the whirling squares. And if I open this up this way, that pretty much does, did I do something wrong? That pretty much gives us the square and the ratio. Do you see it? If I take the diagonal of that and I intersect it at 90 degrees from a corner, and I bring that vertical down at that square, because that will give us that division again. There it is. All the bones in my hand are based on that ratio, and the rest of nature is. So what you have to understand is that early man, presumably, I wasn't there. Old I am, but not that old. Early man must have sat in his unheated cave, lacking air condition or room service, with meteorites pounding the earth, earthquakes stirring up all kinds of havoc, wondering who was running the show. And he had to placate this someone, or group of somebodies, these gods on some hill someplace. So he examined everything in nature. Everything he could get his hands on, he measured. And what he discovered was there was a ratio proportion in forming everything in nature. And he assumed, presumably, that he'd decoded the language of his gods. Needing the cooperation and the protection of his gods, he built temples based on this ratio. He put altars in the temples designed on this ratio. He put vessels for libations on the altar tables based on this ratio. When he put effigies of his gods in his temples, they were based on this ratio, because the ratio, the geometry he employed, was in effect a prayer. All of Muslim art is based on these systems. All of African secret systems and mysteries are based on these ratios. The Egyptians used it, the Assyrians used it, the Greeks, the Italians, the Renaissance, everybody used it. And yet today, while most of the major older artists do employ it and pretend that they don't, and will not discuss it, and certainly almost none of them will teach it in the schools that our students go to study in. Younger students are not being taught this, and it is in fact the basis of Western, Asian, African art. You don't put a line down unless you know where you're going to put it in a rectangle. You don't put the line down unless you know how long it's going to be. You have to know what direction it's going in. Is it the Baroque? Is it the sinister diagonal of the rectangle? Is it the reciprocal? There are names, and there are terms, and there are systems, and it'll be my task to teach them to you. So all I ask is that you do your very best to fulfill the assignments. I will tell you when you do something that's wrong, because I understand you're here wishing to improve your work. And when you bring your homework in, we're going to put it on that wall. And we affectionately call that wall, which has recently been pristinely painted, thank you, Sarah, we call that wall the impaling wall. So you'll put your work up, and I will proceed to tell you what you've done wrong. And all I ask of you, because I don't assume you know anything, I'm sure many of you know as much or more than I do, but I assume that you don't know anything, and that my responsibility is to teach you. Unlike some art schools that want to make sure you're talented and then they neglect you, my responsibility is to start from zero and to teach. So this is where we're going. This is what we're doing. And I do require, as I said earlier, that anyone who wishes to continue studying with me is going to have to take this course twice, because the volume of information I'm going to purvey is greater than you can absorb, understand, and develop skills with in 9 weeks. No one can presume to teach you to draw in 9 weeks. In 18 weeks, we can accomplish a great deal. And you've seen the work here, you've seen it on the website, you've got some idea of what students who've studied here have achieved. So I'm confident that we've developed